On February 25, 2024, Thomas Kingston, a former Foreign Office worker who spent time in Iraq, later a financier, and the husband of Lady Gabriella Windsor, sat down for a quiet Sunday lunch with his parents. To the outside world, he was the man who had won the game of life, the definition of British capability and charm. But as the meal concluded, he offered a brief, tight smile, excused himself, and walked into a locked outbuilding on the estate. 30 minutes later, his father forced the door open to find a scene of incomprehensible horror. The golden man of the British aristocracy was dead, a gun lying by his side, his perfect life dismantled in a fraction of a second. This was not just a death. It was the shattering of an image the public thought was unbreakable. How does a man who stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace and negotiated for human lives in Baghdad end up alone in a cold outbuilding with a firearm? His death shattered the illusion of the establishment, exposing the terrifying fragility hidden beneath the veneer of having it all. But to fathom the depths of such a fall, we must look past the headlines and the royal weddings to understand the construction of the mask Thomas Kingston wore so beautifully, and which in the end may have suffocated him. Thomas Henry Robin Kingston was born in 1978, a year that sat on the cusp of a new era in Britain. The chaotic, strike-ridden 70s were giving way to the sharp-elbowed ambition of the Thatcher years. He was born into the kind of family that serves as the spine of the nation, solid, professional, deeply rooted in the values of duty and discretion. His father, Martin, was a highly successful barrister, a Queen's Counsel specializing in planning and environmental law. This is a world of precision, of intellect, of winning arguments through logic rather than emotion. His mother, Jill, was the grounding force, the keeper of the home. Growing up in Evesham, Worcestershire, Thomas was the archetype of the English country boy. But he wasn't just any boy. He was, by all accounts, gifted. In the British class system, there is a designated path for boys like Thomas. It is a conveyor belt of excellence. Prep school, public school, a top-tier university, and then a career in law, finance, or the military. It is a path that offers immense privilege, but it demands a specific price: conformity. You must be excellent, but you must not be odd. You must be ambitious, but you must not be loud. Thomas navigated this path with the ease of a natural athlete. He attended Bristol University, a favored hunting ground for the bright and beautiful, who found Oxford or Cambridge perhaps too intense or too cloistered. At Bristol, he studied economic history. He was popular, handsome, and charming. But even then, there was a hum of something different in his engine. Most of his peers were laser-focused on securing internships at Goldman Sachs or climbing the ladder of London's social scene. Thomas could have done that. He could have walked straight from graduation into a six-figure salary in the city. He had the brain for it, and certainly the connections. But Thomas Kingston had a streak of the ascetic in him, a desire for a life that meant something more than just accumulation. He was a man of deep, albeit quiet, Christian faith. This wasn't the performative religion of state occasions. It was a personal, driving moral compass. He looked at the world at the turn of the millennium, a world about to be set on fire by the events of September 11th, 2001, and he felt a pull toward the flames. While his friends were buying their first flats in Fulham and arguing about bonuses, Thomas made a decision that baffled many. He joined the diplomatic missions unit of the Foreign Office, and he didn't ask for a posting in Paris or Rome. He went to Baghdad. It is impossible to overstate the danger of Baghdad in the years following the 2003 invasion. The city was a slaughterhouse. It was the Wild West of geopolitics, a place where the rule of law had evaporated, replaced by the rule of the car bomb and the sniper. The green zone offered a flimsy illusion of safety, but the red zone, the rest of the city, was a cauldron of sectarian violence, kidnapping rings, and insurgency. This was where Thomas Kingston chose to spend his 20s. He wasn't there as a soldier, carrying a rifle and surrounded by a platoon. He was there as a project manager for the International Center for Reconciliation, working under the legendary Canon Andrew White, known as the Vicar of Baghdad. Canon White is a figure of almost biblical proportions, a man who stayed in Iraq when everyone else fled, a man who sat down with warlords and militia leaders to plead for peace. And right beside him, in the dust and the heat, was the young, handsome graduate from Bristol University. Thomas's role was not to fight, but to talk. He was a negotiator. Specifically, he was involved in negotiating the release of hostages. This is work that strips the soul bare. You are dealing with men who see human life as a currency. You are sitting across the table from people who have tortured and killed, and you have to suppress your revulsion, suppress your fear, and find a way to make a deal. You have to be the calmest person in the room when the room is burning. Canon White later described Thomas not as a thrill seeker, but as a problem solver. He was an exceptional young man, White would say after Thomas's death, his voice heavy with the memory of those days. He makes things happen. There is a story from this time that encapsulates the terrifying reality of Thomas's existence in Iraq. He and Canon White were driving through the city. Transport in Baghdad was a Russian roulette. Every journey could be your last. They were approaching the Anglican church where White preached, a beacon of faith in a sea of rubble. Suddenly, the world turned white. A suicide bomber detonated just yards from them. The concussive blast would have hit them like a physical blow, a wall of heat and pressure that shatters glass and bursts eardrums. In the aftermath of such an explosion, there is a moment of total sensory overload. The smell of cordite, the screams of the dying, the dust choking the air. 22 people died in that blast. Thomas Kingston survived. He walked out of the smoke, checked his limbs, checked on the Canon, and continued with his work. This is the crucible. This is the moment where the Thomas Kingston of the future was forged. When you survive something like that, when you see 22 human beings turn to meat in the blink of an eye, something inside you changes forever. You learn that life is cheap. You learn that safety is an illusion. But most importantly, you learn to compartmentalize. You take the horror, the fear, the image of the blood, and you lock it in a steel box in the back of your mind. You weld the box shut. You put on your suit, you smile, and you say, "I'm fine." For 3 years, Thomas lived in this high adrenaline, high-stakes environment. He mediated disputes between warring tribal leaders. He delivered food to besieged communities. He looked death in the face over and over again. It was a period of intense, vibrating aliveness. In a war zone, everything is clarified. There are no petty worries about mortgage rates or social standing. There is only survival and the mission. For a young man of faith and purpose, it must have been intoxicating. He was a hero in the classical sense, a warrior for peace in a land of war. But wars end, or at least tours of duty do. Eventually, the time came for Thomas to leave Baghdad. He had done his bit. He had survived the red zone. Now he had to face a challenge that, in its own insidious way, was just as difficult: coming home. The transition from Baghdad to London is not just a change of geography, it is a change of reality. Thomas returned to a city obsessed with property prices, celebrity gossip, and the trivialities of modern existence. He carried with him the ghosts of Iraq, the faces of the people he couldn't save, the sound of the explosions. But in the polite circles of British society, you do not talk about the smell of burning flesh over dinner. You do not explain what it feels like to negotiate for a human life. It is considered gauche, intense, too much. So Thomas did what he was trained to do. He adapted. He took the skills he had honed in the negotiation rooms of Baghdad, the ability to read people, the ironclad emotional control, the tolerance for risk, and he applied them to the only other industry that valued them: finance. He joined Schroders and later Voltaire Capital Management. He became an analyst, then a director. He specialized in frontier markets. Investments speak for volatile, dangerous, or developing regions. It was a clever way to bridge his two lives. He could use his knowledge of the world's rougher edges to make money for the smooth men of the city. He was the guy who wasn't afraid to fly to Tripoli or Kabul to close a deal. On the surface, the reintegration was a triumph. Thomas Kingston became a rising star in the financial world. He made money. He dressed impeccably. He was the perfect guest at dinner parties. Handsome, mysterious, with a backstory that was just dangerous enough to be sexy, but not traumatic enough to be disturbing. He was the man who had been to Iraq, a label that gave him a gravitas his peers lacked. But deep down, the architecture of his psyche had been altered. He had learned to live behind a mask of high-functioning competence. He had learned that his value lay in his ability to handle things that others couldn't. He was the fixer. He was the strong one. And the problem with being the strong one is that nobody ever asks if you need carrying. As he entered his 30s, Thomas was the ultimate catch. He was a war hero with a portfolio. He was a man of God who knew how to make a profit. He was ready for the next phase of the establishment assembly line, the perfect marriage. He began to move in the rarefied circles of the British aristocracy. This is a world that is small, incestuous, and fiercely guarded. It is a world where everyone knows everyone else's grandmother, where summer holidays are spent in the same 3 castles in Scotland, and where discretion is the highest currency. Thomas fit in perfectly. He had the accent, the manners, and the looks. But he also had that edge, the Baghdad gloss, and that made him irresistible. It was in this glittering, dangerous world that he would meet the women who would define his public image. First, there was Natalie Hicks Laubeck, an old flame of Prince William. Then in 2011, he entered the eye of the media hurricane. He began dating Pippa Middleton. At that moment in history, Pippa Middleton was arguably the most famous single woman on the planet. Her sister Catherine had just married Prince William. Pippa's silhouette at the royal wedding had sparked a global obsession. To date Pippa was to invite the full blinding glare of the world's media into your life. The paparazzi camped outside her door. Every dinner date was analyzed. Every outfit critiqued. For a man who had spent years operating in the shadows of Baghdad, avoiding snipers and kidnappers, this was a new kind of war zone. But Thomas handled it with the same eerie calm he had displayed in Iraq. He didn't buckle. He didn't sell stories. He walked beside her, protective but not possessive, handsome and silent. He shielded her. Though the romance with Pippa eventually cooled, the friendship did not. In a testament to his character, or perhaps his extreme diplomacy, they remained incredibly close. He was the rare ex-boyfriend who was not exiled, but embraced. He became a fixture in the Middleton circle, a trusted ally in a world full of snakes. By his late 30s, Thomas Kingston had successfully navigated the minefields of war and the minefields of celebrity romance. He had emerged unscathed, or so it appeared. He was a man polished to a high shine, a diamond forged in pressure. But diamonds, for all their hardness, are brittle. If you strike them at the exact right angle, they do not bend, they shatter. As he approached his 40th birthday, Thomas was still single, still searching. He was a man with a vast capacity for love and duty, looking for a place to bestow it. He needed a partner who understood the unique pressures of his life, the need for public perfection and private sanctuary. He needed someone who knew the rules of the game but also knew how to laugh at them. And then, the universe introduced him to Lady Gabriella Windsor. It was a match that seemed written in the stars, or at least in the ledgers of Burke's peerage. She was royalty, but on the fringe, close enough to the throne to have the glamour, far enough away to have a life. She was intelligent, artistic, and, like him, a little bit wary of the spotlight. She was the final piece of the puzzle. The stage was set for the wedding of the year, the happily ever after that would cement Thomas Kingston's place in the heart of the British establishment. But as he stood on the precipice of this new royal life, the shadows of the past, the locked boxes in his mind, the silence of the desert, the pressure to be perfect, were not gone. They were merely waiting. The golden man was about to climb even higher, but the air gets thinner at the top, and the fall becomes much, much longer. If Thomas Kingston was a man constructed of steel and silence, Lady Gabriella Windsor was a woman woven from silk and scrutiny. To understand the gravitational pull between them, one must first understand the peculiar, rarefied ecosystem that Gabriella inhabited. She was not a major royal in the sense of William or Harry, followed by a cavalcade of protection officers and courtiers. She occupied the twilight zone of the House of Windsor, the minor royal. This is a dangerous place to live. You have the name, the castle address, and the historical burden, but you do not have the sovereign grant. You are expected to curtsy to your grandmother's cousin, the queen, and appear on the balcony for trooping the color looking impeccable. But on Monday morning, you have to go to work. You have to earn a living. You are a living oxymoron, a working-class princess. Gabriella, known to her friends simply as Ella, was the daughter of Prince and Princess Michael of Kent. In the royal menagerie, the Kents were the peacocks, glamorous, slightly controversial, and undeniably grand. Her father, Prince Michael, was the Queen's first cousin, a man who looked so much like Tsar Nicholas II of Russia that it was unnerving. He was old-school royalty, a man of quiet dignity and endless charity work. Her mother, however, was the lightning rod. Princess Michael of Kent, born Baroness Marie Christine von Reibnitz, was a figure of operatic complexity. Dubbed Princess Pushy by a cruel press, she was tall, imperious, and never afraid of a microphone. She brought a continental Austro-Hungarian grandeur to the pragmatic Windsors. She was a woman who sucked the oxygen out of every room she entered. Growing up in the shadow of such a formidable matriarch, Ella had learned the art of shrinking. She became the quiet one. She was the observer. While her brother, Lord Frederick Windsor, had his wild years in the tabloids, Ella studied. She went to Brown University in the Ivy League, then Oxford. She became a writer, a branding consultant, a singer. She cultivated a life that was purposefully low-key, shielding her gentle nature from the sharp elbows of her mother's reputation. When Thomas Kingston met Ella in 2015, introduced by mutual friends in the tight-knit circle of London society, the recognition was likely instant. They were two people who had mastered the art of being adjacent to power without being consumed by it. Thomas had stood next to Canon White in Baghdad and next to Pippa Middleton in Chelsea. Ella had stood next to the Queen and her mother. Both knew what it was like to be the calm center of a chaotic storm. Their courtship was a masterpiece of discretion. In an era where relationships are broadcast in real time on Instagram stories, Thomas and Ella were ghosts. They dated for years, without a single scandal. There were no drunken exits from nightclubs, no leaked arguments, no cryptic tweets. They were seen at Wimbledon looking polished. They were seen at art gallery openings looking intellectual. They were the couple that everyone invited because they were effortless. For the chaotic House of Kent, Thomas was not just a boyfriend, he was a stabilizer. He was a man who understood finance, who understood diplomacy, and who was unfazed by big personalities. He could charm Princess Michael, no small feat, while talking strategy with the prince. He was the perfect son-in-law, a self-made man with the manners of a duke. He brought a sense of solidity to a family that often felt like it was teetering on the edge of its own grandeur. In August 2018, on the rugged, windswept island of Sark in the Channel Islands, Thomas proposed. The setting was telling. Sark is a place out of time, no cars, only horse-drawn carriages and bicycles, a feudal remnant that feels like a stepping stone back to the 1950s. It was quiet, isolated, and steeped in nature. It was the anti-London. There, away from the cameras and the noise, Thomas asked the Queen's cousin to be his wife. The engagement announcement came from Buckingham Palace in September. It was traditional, formal, and warmly received, but the timing was significant. The royal family was in the throes of Meghan mania. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex had married just months earlier, and the whirlwind of their celebrity was already beginning to cause structural vibrations in the monarchy. Amidst the noise of the Sussex Revolution, the Kingston-Windsor engagement felt like a comforting return to the old ways. It was a safe bet. The wedding was set for May 18, 2019. The venue, St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The choice of venue was inevitable. It is the parish church of the royal family, but it invited immediate, stark comparisons. Exactly 1 year prior, Harry and Meghan had stood in that same spot. Their wedding had been a global spectacle, a Hollywood production featuring Oprah Winfrey, George Clooney, and a gospel choir. It was loud, modern, and transformative. Thomas and Ella's wedding was the mirror image. It was the establishment talking to itself. There were no Hollywood A-listers. Instead, there was the solid core of the British aristocracy. There was the Queen, beaming in pink, looking far more relaxed than she had at other recent nuptials. There was Prince Philip, frail and retired, who made a rare public appearance specifically for Ella. There was Prince Harry, attending solo, looking somewhat wistful as he watched a traditional royal wedding unfold. Thomas Kingston stood at the altar, waiting for his bride. He wore a morning suit, not a military uniform, and he looked every inch the leading man. When Ella arrived, wearing a stunning lace gown by Luisa Beccaria, she looked ethereal. But if you look closely at the footage of that day, you see something interesting in Thomas's face. It is not just joy, it is a profound steely focus. Marrying into the royal family is a military operation. The eyes of the world are on you. Every twitch, every smile, every glance is recorded for history. For a man who valued his privacy, who had spent years operating in the shadows of Baghdad, this was the ultimate exposure. He was standing in a chapel where kings were buried. He was marrying a woman whose bloodline went back to William the Conqueror. The weight of the institution was pressing down on his shoulders. In that moment, he ceased to be Thomas Kingston, private citizen. He became Mr. Thomas Kingston, a supporting character in the great soap opera of the British monarchy. He was signing a contract not just with Ella, but with history. The kiss on the steps of the chapel was picture perfect. The bells rang. The crowd cheered. The couple drove away in a classic car. It was the zenith of his life. He had climbed the mountain. He looked like the ultimate establishment success story. Professional, polished, and newly tied to the royal world. But the fairy tale ends when the credits roll. Real life begins the next morning. And for Thomas and Ella, The happily ever after was complicated by the unique pressures of their position. They settled in Notting Hill, in a beautiful home that reflected their dual status: wealthy, but not palace wealthy; stylish, but not ostentatious. Thomas returned to work. This is a crucial point that is often overlooked. Unlike Prince William, whose job is to be Prince William, Thomas Kingston had to wake up every day and navigate the brutal, high-pressure world of frontier market finance. He was a director at Devonport Capital. His job involved identifying investment opportunities in economies that were often unstable or recovering from conflict. It was high-stress work. It required travel, risk assessment, and the constant pressure to deliver returns. He couldn't just coast on his royal connections. In the city, results are the only currency. If anything, his royal connection was a target on his back. He had to be better, sharper, and cleaner than everyone else, because any failure would end up on the front page of the Daily Mail. Simultaneously, he had to perform his royal duties. While not a working royal, he was expected to attend the big events: Ascot, Trooping the Color, the Thanksgiving services. He had to look perfect. He had to make small talk with ambassadors and duchesses. He had to navigate the complex internal politics of the family, the jealousies, the protocols, the unwritten rules of who stands where and who speaks when. He was living two lives. By day, he was the hard-nosed financier dealing with the gritty realities of emerging markets. By night and on weekends, he was the courtier, the polished gentleman in the velvet slippers. For a man who had learned to compartmentalize in Iraq, this might have seemed manageable at first. He added new layers of pressure on top of the old trauma: finance, public scrutiny, and royal expectations. Outwardly, he kept functioning. Inwardly, the strain kept accumulating. But the problem with compartmentalization is that it takes energy. It takes a tremendous amount of psychic fuel to keep those doors shut. And as the 2020s dawned, the fuel supply began to run low. The year 2020 was a hammer blow to the world, but it hit the middle class of the aristocracy particularly hard. The pandemic shut down the social circuit that was the lifeblood of their influence. It froze the financial markets. For a frontier market specialist, a global lockdown is a catastrophe. Deals stall. Economies collapse. The delicate web of relationships that Thomas had built in developing nations would have been strained to the breaking point. We do not know the specifics of Thomas's financial situation during this time, but we know the context. The Kents, despite their grandeur, have always lived with a certain financial precariousness. Princess Michael has famously had to sell off jewelry and art in the past. They live in Kensington Palace, yes, but they pay rent. The pressure to maintain the royal standard without the royal income is a crushing weight. Did Thomas feel this burden? Did he feel that, as the capable, wealthy son-in-law, it was his job to shore up the foundations of the House of Kent? Did he feel that he had to be the provider, the protector, the man who never said no and never said I can't? There is a tragic archetype in British culture: the good man. The good man pays his bills. The good man opens doors for ladies. The good man never complains. The good man absorbs the stress of those around him like a sponge. Thomas Kingston was the ultimate good man. He absorbed the trauma of the hostages in Baghdad. He absorbed the media glare of Pippa Middleton. He absorbed the eccentricities of the Kents. But a sponge can only hold so much water before it becomes heavy, sodden, and begins to sink. As the lockdowns lifted and the world tried to return to normal, the cracks were invisible, but they were there. The smiling depression was likely taking root. This is a terrifying condition because it has no symptoms that an outsider can see. The sufferer does not stay in bed all day. They do not stop shaving. They do not cry in public. In fact, they often become more active, more perfect, more helpful. Perhaps he went there to say goodbye in a way that wouldn't be recognized until it was too late. Sunday, February 25th, 2024. The sky was likely the color of slate. The English countryside in late winter is a study in dormancy. Bare trees, muddy fields, a quietness that feels like the earth is holding its breath. Inside the Kingston home, the ritual of Sunday lunch unfolded. This is a sacred institution in British family life. It is a time of connection, of roast beef and Yorkshire puddings, of safety. Thomas sat at the table with his mother and father. The inquest would later reveal that he had eaten lunch with them. He was present. He was functioning. Imagine the conversation. It was probably gentle. Martin and Jill, proud of their son, perhaps asking about Ella, about work, about the London traffic. Thomas, the diplomat, would have answered. He would have deflected any concern. He would have played the part of the dutiful son one last time. He gave them the gift of a final normal memory, unaware that he was also giving them the prelude to a nightmare. When the meal concluded, Thomas stood up. There was no dramatic speech, no tears. He simply said he needed to go. But he didn't go to his car. He walked out of the back door. The cold air would have hit his face. He walked across the grounds of the estate, his shoes crunching on the gravel or sinking into the damp grass. He headed toward an outbuilding, a separate structure, perhaps a garage or a workshop, a place of utility, a place of privacy. He entered. He locked the door from the inside. Back in the main house, the clock ticked. 2 p.m. turned to 2:30 p.m., then 3 p.m. The rhythm of the afternoon began to stutter. Where was Tom? Martin Kingston is a man of the law, a QC used to facts and logic, but the logic of a missing son defies professional training. He went to look. He likely called out Thomas's name, his voice drifting over the garden, unanswered. He checked the car. He checked the grounds. Finally, he came to the outbuilding. The door was locked. He knocked. No answer. At that moment, the world of Martin Kingston, the world of order, of success, of family, began to dissolve. He forced the door. What he found inside is the private trauma of the Kingston family, a scene that no father should ever witness. Thomas was found with a traumatic head injury. A gun was present at the scene. The police and paramedics were called at approximately 6 p.m., but it was a formality. The immediate aftermath of a suicide is a chaos of logistics and shock. The police arrived, blue lights flashing against the dark country lanes. The scene was secured. The coroner was notified. The machinery of the state began to process the death of a citizen. But this was not just a citizen. This was a man connected to the crown. The news traveled up the chain of command with lightning speed. From the Gloucestershire police to the palace protection officers, to the private secretaries, and finally, to the king. King Charles III was currently dealing with his own mortality. He had recently been diagnosed with cancer. The royal family was already fragile, stretched thin by illness and the absence of the Princess of Wales. The news of Thomas's death was a hammer blow to an institution already under siege. For Lady Gabriella, the call must have been an annihilation. She was in London, or perhaps elsewhere, waiting for her husband to return. Instead, she received the news that he would never return. The widowhood that had come to her grandmother and her aunts in old age had come to her at 42. The public announcement came on Tuesday, February 27th, 2 days after the event. The delay speaks to the shock and the need to notify the vast network of royal relations. Buckingham Palace released a statement on behalf of Lady Gabriella, Martin, and Jill Kingston, and Thomas's sisters, Joanna and Emma. It is with the deepest sorrow that we announce the death of Thomas Kingston, our beloved husband, son, and brother. Tom was an exceptional man who lit up the lives of all who knew him. His death has come as a great shock to the whole family, and we ask you to respect our privacy as we mourn his passing. The phrase, great shock, was doing heavy lifting. It was a polite British understatement for incomprehensible horror. Simultaneously, a statement was released from the King and Queen. The King and the Queen have been informed of Thomas's death and join Prince and Princess Michael of Kent and all those who knew him in grieving a much-loved member of the family. In particular, their Majesties send their most heartfelt thoughts and prayers to Gabriella and to all the Kingston family. The press went into overdrive. The headlines were screaming the question that everyone was whispering: how and why? Tragedy of Lady Gabriella's husband, Thomas Kingston, dead at 45, found in locked outbuilding. The initial reports were careful. They stated there were no suspicious circumstances and no third party involved. In the coded language of British journalism, this points to one thing only: suicide. But the public couldn't parse it. This was Thomas Kingston. He was handsome, he was rich, he was a hero. He was married to a princess. He had just been seen smiling on Valentine's Day. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. It broke the narrative that money and status are a shield against darkness. On Friday, March 1st, the inquest was opened at Gloucestershire Coroner's Court. The proceedings were brief, clinical, and brutal. Senior Coroner Katie Scarrett sat at the bench. She read the facts into the record. She confirmed his name, his age, his address, and then she confirmed the mechanism of death. Mr. Kingston was visiting his parents' home in the Cotswolds. On February 25th, 2024, he ate lunch with his parents. His father went out to walk the dogs. On his return, Mr. Kingston was not in the house, and after approximately 30 minutes, his mother went to look for him. His father forced entry to a locked outbuilding when no reply could be gained. Mr. Kingston was found inside with a catastrophic head injury. A gun was present at the scene. Emergency services were called. Police are satisfied the death is not suspicious. The word gun landed with a specific weight. In Britain, guns are rare. They are the tools of farmers and soldiers. Thomas, having been in the diplomatic missions unit and moving in country circles, likely had access to firearms for sport or had retained a license. But the use of a gun implies a violent, definitive intent. It is not a cry for help. It is a determination to leave. The inquest was adjourned. The court emptied. But the silence that Thomas Kingston left behind was louder than ever. Later reporting around the inquest raised questions about whether adverse effects from prescribed medication may have played a role, prompting wider debate about how such risks are communicated. In the days that followed, the autopsy of his life began in the press. Friends were interviewed. They were baffled. He was happy, said one. He was focused on his work, said another. He and Ella were solid. Nobody had seen it coming. And that is the terrifying lesson of Thomas Kingston. We want our tragedies to be predictable. We want to see the warning signs, the drinking, the erratic behavior, the financial ruin. We want a reason that fits into a neat narrative box. But sometimes the reason is invisible. Sometimes the war is entirely internal. Thomas Kingston had spent his life navigating external wars in Iraq, in the markets, in the media. He had won them all. But the internal war, the silent battle against his own chemistry or his own existential dread, was one he fought alone, without a treaty, without a ceasefire, and ultimately without a survivor. As the shock began to settle into grief, the focus shifted to the funeral. It would be the final public act of Thomas's life, a gathering of the establishment to say goodbye to the man who had played the game perfectly, right up until the moment he decided to stop playing. When the player leaves the stage so abruptly, the curtain does not simply fall, it crashes down, leaving the audience in a stunned silence that must be filled by ritual. The shock of the Cotswolds had to give way to the ancient machinery of mourning, a process the British aristocracy has perfected over centuries to contain the uncontainable. The raw, bloody reality of the outbuilding was left behind, exchanged for the hushed, reverent gloom of the capital, where the establishment prepared to close ranks and perform its final solemn duty to one of its own. The Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace is a vessel of secrets. It is small, intimate, and heavy with history. It was here that Charles I took the Holy Sacrament before walking out to his execution in 1649. It was here that Queen Victoria married Prince Albert, and it was here, in the quiet sanctum of the Tudor court, that the coffin of Diana, Princess of Wales, lay for 5 days before her funeral, watched over by her family. On March 12, 2024, the Chapel Royal opened its doors for Thomas Kingston. It was a Tuesday. The London sky was a bruised purple-gray. The event was not a state funeral. There were no cameras broadcasting to millions, no gun carriages, no flags at half-mast on government buildings. It was a private cremation service, strictly for those who actually knew the man behind the headlines. 140 guests filed in. The list was a microcosm of the British establishment, stripped of its pomp and left only with its grief. The Prince of Wales, William, arrived quietly. He walked alone. His wife, Catherine, was absent, recovering from her own surgery and dealing with a cancer diagnosis that the world did not yet know about. The king was absent, undergoing his own treatment. Queen Camilla was hosting a reception at Buckingham Palace, keeping the show on the road. The presence of Prince William was significant. He was not there as the heir to the throne. He was there as a contemporary, a man of the same generation who understood the unique pressures of their shared world. He sat in the pews, head bowed, surrounded by the Kents, Prince Michael, looking frail and devastated, Princess Michael, hidden behind a veil, and Lady Gabriella. Lady Gabriella Windsor, the widow at 42, followed the coffin. Just 5 years earlier, she had walked down a different aisle, in a different chapel, toward Thomas. Then, she had been a vision in lace, walking toward a future that seemed guaranteed. Now she was walking into a void. The cruelty of the juxtaposition, the wedding and the funeral, the beginning and the end, was almost too much to bear for those watching. The service was led by the subdean of the Chapels Royal, the Reverend Canon Paul Wright, with a sermon by the Reverend Richard Chartres, the former Bishop of London and a close friend of the king. The hymns were traditional, the prayers ancient. For an hour, the machinery of the modern world was suspended. There was only the smell of incense, the sound of the choir, and the reality of a wooden box containing a man who, 2 weeks prior, had been laughing at a lunch table. When the coffin emerged, it was driven away in a black hearse, not to a fanfare, but to a cremation. Thomas Kingston was returned to ash. The golden man was gone. But as the guests dispersed into the London afternoon, returning to their townhouses and their offices, the question that hung over the service remained unanswered. The how had been established by the coroner. The why was a ghost that refused to be exorcised. In the weeks and months that followed, the autopsy of Thomas Kingston's life moved from the coroner's court to the dinner tables of London society. Why does a man who has everything choose to leave it? The theories that emerged were not scandalous in the tabloid sense. There was no secret second family, no illicit addiction found, but they were revealing of the toxic ecology of the modern upper class. First, there was the finance trap. Thomas worked in frontier markets. This is not the steady, boring world of index funds. It is the cowboy country of capitalism. You are dealing with economies that can collapse overnight due to a coup, a plague, or a sanction. Devonport Capital, where he was a director, operated in places like Iraq and other developing nations. While there is no evidence of financial ruin, the stress of maintaining positions in such a volatile environment is corrosive. Furthermore, marrying into the royal family creates a lifestyle inflation that is almost impossible to resist. You are surrounded by people with generational wealth, castles, art collections, land. But as a minor royal spouse, you have to pay your own way. You have to dress the part, travel the part, and live the part, but you are doing it on a salary. The cognitive dissonance of dining with kings on Tuesday and worrying about a mortgage on Wednesday creates a psychic fracture. Did Thomas feel he was running on a treadmill that was moving just a little too fast? Second, there was the Baghdad shadow. Trauma is not a linear event. It does not hit you and then fade away. It can lie dormant for decades like a virus in the blood. Thomas had witnessed horrors in Iraq that most people only see in movies. He had developed a coping mechanism of extreme compartmentalization. He locked the monsters in the basement. But midlife is often when the basement door starts to rattle. As men hit their 40s, the testosterone-fueled invincibility of youth fades. They start to look back. They start to feel the weight of the things they have carried. Did the face of a hostage he couldn't save come back to him? Did the sound of that suicide bomb in 2004 finally stop ringing in his ears, only to be replaced by a deafening silence? And finally, there was the trap of the perfect gentleman. This is perhaps the most British and most lethal factor. Thomas Kingston was a man defined by his competence. He was the one who fixed things. He was the one who listened. He was the one who smiled. In the psychology of the good man, there is no room for weakness. To admit that you are struggling is to admit that you are a fraud. If he was struggling internally, he may have felt unable to speak about it to the people closest to him. Who do you tell? Your wife? The princess? Your father? The QC? Your friend, the future king? In his mind, he was the pillar holding up the roof. If the pillar cracks, the house falls. So perversely, the only way to save the house from seeing the pillar crumble is to remove the pillar entirely. It is a warped, tragic logic, but to a depressed mind, it can look like the only honorable exit. The death of Thomas Kingston forced the royal family to look in the mirror. For decades, the Windsors have preached the gospel of mental health. William and Harry founded Heads Together. They urged the nation to talk. And yet, right in their midst, in their own inner circle, a man was dying of silence. It exposed the limitations of the Royal Awareness Campaign. You can talk about mental health on a podium, but can you talk about it at the Sunday lunch table? Can a man like Thomas Kingston, steeped in the codes of duty and stoicism, actually say, "I am terrified"? The answer, it seems, was no. As the spring of 2024 turned into summer, Lady Gabriella was left to navigate the wreckage. She moved out of the Notting Hill home they had shared. It was too full of ghosts. She reportedly moved back into Kensington Palace with her parents, retreating to the nursery of her childhood. It is a profound tragedy for a woman of 42 to find herself back in her parents' home, not as a visitor, but as a widow. She had done everything right. She had waited for love. She had married a good man, and in an afternoon it had all been erased. Gabriella canceled her engagements. She stopped singing. She vanished from the social circuit. The royal family, to their credit, closed ranks around her. King Charles, fighting his own battle with mortality, reportedly called her often. There is a bond between those who have been touched by the random cruelty of fate. And in 2024, The House of Windsor was a ward of wounded souls. But the silence of Thomas Kingston continued to echo. It echoed in the boardrooms of the city where men in sharp suits looked at each other with a new wary recognition. If it could happen to Tom, could it happen to me? It echoed in the mess halls of the military, a reminder that the war doesn't end when you fly home. And it echoed in the empty pews of the Chapel Royal, a reminder that even the oldest, strongest institutions cannot protect the human heart from breaking. The story of Thomas Kingston was nearing its final narrative conclusion, but the lesson it taught was just beginning to be understood. He had shown the world that the perfect life is a myth, and that behind the golden gates, the shadows are just as long and just as cold as they are anywhere else. Yet, the cruelest law of nature is that the world does not stop for shadows, nor does it pause for the breaking of hearts. The relentless machinery of the royal calendar continued to turn, dragging the grieving survivors out of the darkness of the chapel and back into the unforgiving light of the public eye. The season shifted, demanding that life, no matter how fractured, no matter how empty the space beside them, must resume its performance. As the spring of 2024 bled into summer, the British social season began its annual relentless rotation. The Chelsea Flower Show bloomed, the tennis nets were strung at Wimbledon, and the turf was manicured at Ascot. The machinery of the upper class does not stop for grief, it merely incorporates it, dressing it in black silk and hiding it behind the brim of a hat. But for Lady Gabriella Windsor, the season was no longer a calendar of parties. It was a minefield of memories. Every venue, every lawn, every champagne reception was a place where she had once stood beside Thomas. Yet, in a display of resilience that rivals that of any monarch in her family's history, Gabriella stepped back into the light. On June 15th, 2024, during the Trooping the Color, the King's official birthday, observers noticed a figure standing quietly at a window in Buckingham Palace. It was Ella. She was watching the RAF fly past, the thunder of the jets shaking the glass. She was not on the balcony with the main family. That stage was reserved for the King and the Princess of Wales, making her own triumphant return. But she was there. It was a soft re-entry, a signal to the world that she was still standing. But the true moment of catharsis came 3 days later, at Royal Ascot. Ascot is the holy week of the British aristocracy. It is a place of rigid rules and high stakes. On the first day of the races, Lady Gabriella arrived. She was not hiding in a car. She arrived in the royal procession, riding in a carriage. When she stepped onto the turf of the royal enclosure, a ripple went through the crowd. Then, a moment occurred that broke the protocol of the day. Prince William, the heir to the throne, saw her. He didn't offer a stiff handshake. He didn't offer a polite nod. He reached out and pulled her into a tight, lingering hug. The photograph of that embrace went viral. In it, you see the Prince of Wales, a man carrying the weight of his father's illness and his wife's cancer, holding the widow of his old friend. It was not a royal greeting. It was two human beings clinging to each other in the wreckage of a terrible year. It was a visual acknowledgement of the shared pain that had defined 2024 for the House of Windsor. In that hug, the stiff upper lip trembled, just for a second, and the world saw the raw humanity beneath the top hats and tails. This moment signaled the beginning of the post-Thomas era. Gabriella was surviving. She was surrounded by a phalanx of family support: Zara Tindall, Princess Anne, the King himself. They were carrying her when she couldn't walk. But while Gabriella's survival was public, the questions left behind by Thomas Kingston's death began to settle into a darker, more permanent resolve. His suicide was not just a personal tragedy. It was a cultural mirror. Thomas Kingston was the canary in the coal mine of modern masculinity, particularly the high-achieving, high-stakes masculinity of the establishment. He represented a generation of men who were sold a lie, that if you are handsome, wealthy, successful, and stoic, you are immune to the abyss. He proved that the abyss doesn't care about your resume. His death has forced a quiet, uncomfortable conversation in the drawing rooms of London. Men who saw themselves in Thomas, the financiers, the former soldiers, the good husbands, were forced to confront their own fragility. If the man who survived Baghdad's suicide bombers could not survive his own mind, what chance did they have? The Kingston syndrome, if we can call it that, is the lethal combination of perfectionism and silence. It is the belief that one's value is tied entirely to one's utility. Thomas was valuable because he fixed things. He negotiated hostage releases. He managed capital. He supported his wife. When the internal pressure became too great, when he perhaps felt he could no longer be that useful engine of perfection, he didn't know how to exist simply as a flawed human being. He chose extinction over imperfection. This is the tragedy of the golden man. The gold is just a plating. Underneath there is flesh and blood susceptible to the same chemical imbalances, the same fears, and the same darkness as the rest of us. But the plating is so bright, so blinding that nobody sees the cracks until the structure collapses. History will remember Thomas Kingston in contradictory ways. To the public, he will be a footnote in royal history, the handsome husband of a minor royal who died too young. He will be a trivia answer, a tragic figure in the lineage of the Kents. But to those who knew him, and to those who study the anthropology of the British upper class, he will be something more significant. He will be remembered as the man who had it all, and yet found it wasn't enough to sustain life. He will be a warning. His legacy lies in the silence he left behind. It is a silence that demands to be filled not with platitudes about thoughts and prayers, but with honesty. Honesty about the trauma of war. Honesty about the crushing pressure of social expectation. Honesty about the fact that a smile can be the most effective hiding place in the world. As the years pass, the shock of that February Sunday in the Cotswolds will fade. The grass will grow over the memory of the police tape. Lady Gabriella will hopefully find a new path, a new happiness, carrying her scars with the dignity she has already shown. The royal family will continue its slow march through history, absorbing this tragedy as it has absorbed 1,000 others. But in the quiet corners of St. James's Palace or in the dusty archives of the Foreign Office, the ghost of Thomas Kingston remains. He is the young man in the dust of Baghdad, believing he can save the world. He is the groom in the morning suit at Windsor, believing he can master the monarchy. And he is the man in the locked room realizing that the only thing he couldn't master was himself. His life was a brilliant, blinding flare that burned out too fast. And in the darkness that follows, we are left with the uneasy realization that the line between having everything and having nothing is not a wall, but a wire. Razor thin, invisible, and terrifyingly easy to cross. The Cotswolds are quiet again. The spring rains have washed away the traces of the winter tragedy. The stone walls of the Kingston family home stand impassive, guarding their secrets as they have for centuries. In the end, the story of Thomas Kingston is not a story about royalty or finance or war. It is a story about the devastating loneliness of the human experience. We can stand in a crowded room, holding a glass of champagne, surrounded by people who love us, and yet be falling through space utterly alone. We build defenses out of money, status, and reputation. From the outside, his life looked unshakable, but inside, something was already breaking. But there is no fortress strong enough to keep out the night when the night comes from within. The lesson he leaves us is not in how he died, but in the terrifying perfection of how he lived. It is a plea to look behind the mask, to listen to the silence, and to remember that even the strongest among us can break. The golden man is gone, but the echo of his fall will ring in the ears of the establishment for a generation.